It doesn't begin with noise, it begins with absence. Not with the chaos of the city, not with the rage of arguments, not with the hammering of daily obligations. No, the most dangerous signal of psychological collapse often begins in a silence so subtle you mistake it for peace. Jung called this condition emotional starvation, the eerie stillness of a life where nothing feels truly alive. You think you're safe because there is no conflict. You think you're healthy because you never raise your voice. But deep down, you feel it, the vacancy inside your chest, a hollowness where desire used to live. This is what I call the silent vacancy, and it is the quietest, most invisible, and most corrosive destroyer of the human soul. Jung warned that what we repress doesn't disappear. It festers in the unconscious. The perfect family that never fights, the ideal worker who never complains, the dutiful empath who never speaks their needs. Each lives in a prison without bars, sustained not by violence but by absence. No overt harm, only the starvation of authenticity. They see peace where there is only paralysis. They sense stability where there is only suppression. They feel connection where there is only performance. This is why the silent vacancy is more dangerous than the obvious wound. A scar at least tells a story. An emptiness tells nothing. And in that nothing, you begin to doubt your own reality. You tell yourself, I must be fine. After all, nothing is wrong. But Jung observed that silence can itself be the disease, the silence of needs unspoken, truths unexpressed, longings disowned. He wrote, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The vacancy is precisely that, the unconscious directing you through absence. You don't choose joy, you drift. You don't resist exploitation, you submit. You don't collapse dramatically, you wither slowly. Consider this paradox. The people who seem most stable, never angry, never needy, never disruptive, are often the ones most deeply entangled in this vacancy. They are starving, but they have learned to call it serenity. This wasn't peace, this was surrender. And here lies the dark gift of Jung's psychology, to show you that vacancy is not emptiness at all, but a signal, an alarm. Because once you see the silent vacancy for what it is, you can begin the perilous journey into the 7 psychological environments that devour the human mind. You've felt this vacancy before, haven't you? In the room filled with people where you still felt alone. In the long-term relationship where no words were spoken, but every truth was denied. In the job where you smiled on command but could not feel alive. That vacancy is not random. It is a map. And if you follow it into the depths Jung outlined, you'll discover the hidden architecture of your own undoing. The question now is not whether you've been there. You have. The question is whether you're ready to see where it leads. Jung once said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. That avoidance creates not just personal discomfort, it builds entire psychic environments, places of distortion that slowly destroy the mind. You may believe danger comes only from outward aggression, the narcissist's fury, the manipulator's lies, the abuser's rage. But Jung's warning was subtler, more terrifying. He saw that the most destructive forces are not external assaults, but internal landscapes where the unconscious has seized control. This wasn't chaos imposed from outside. This was the unconscious seizing the throne from within. Why does this matter to you now? Because without awareness, you will wander into these environments again and again. Relationships that feel magnetic but end in depletion. Jobs that look stable but hollow your spirit. Friendships that demand silence in exchange for belonging. And here is the paradox that makes this lecture urgent. What destroys the mind does not feel like poison at first. It feels like safety. It feels like normalcy. It feels like the exact thing you've been craving. Stability, love, purpose. Only later do you realize you've been living inside a psychological trap that consumes you piece by piece. Jung called this the great danger of projection. When we deny our own shadow, We unconsciously seek it in others and environments, mistaking captivity for love, mistaking vacancy for peace. So here is my promise. I will guide you through the 7 most dangerous psychological places Jung identified, the environments, inner and outer, where minds quietly corrode. You will learn not only how to recognize them, but how to break free before they consume you. But first, let me anchor this in a living story, one that shook Jung himself, and one that illustrates why these places are not abstract theories but lived realities. Because theory alone cannot wake you, only a story can. Before we step into the 6 phases of collapse, you must see the machinery beneath the drama. Because what appears as chaos in human relationships is, in truth, the predictable outcome of archetypal forces, projection, persona, shadow, and what modern psychology calls supply. Jung taught that the psyche does not present itself as one seamless whole. It splits, masks, and hides. You wear a persona, the social mask that lets you survive in families, jobs, relationships. Useful, yes, but lethal when mistaken for your true self. Beneath that mask lies the shadow, all the traits you were told were too much, too selfish, too dangerous. Anger you swallowed, desires you denied, strength you abandoned. These did not disappear. Jung insisted, what you resist not only persists, it grows in size. The shadow becomes an autonomous force operating from the unconscious with ruthless efficiency. And here enters the mechanism of projection. Because the human ego cannot bear its own darkness, it casts it outward. You begin to see in others what you dare not acknowledge in yourself. What you hate most in your partner is what festers unowned in you. What they despise most in you is what they cannot bear in themselves. Now consider the narcissistic dynamic. What is called supply is simply unconscious regulation by proxy. The narcissist cannot face their shadow, therefore they offload it onto the empath, who absorbs the chaos like a shock absorber. The empath mistakes this absorption for love, calling it compassion. But in truth, it is a psychological power plant, your energy fueling their survival. Because the narcissist's persona is fragile, it must be constantly charged by another's attunement. Therefore, your empathy becomes their battery. And when you withdraw, the mask collapses. This is why the departure of the empath is not a small event. It is annihilation. Jung described this as enantiodromia, the principle that everything, when pushed to its extreme, flips into its opposite. The persona of superiority flips into a pit of vacancy. The illusion of power flips into exposure of weakness. And here, now, you see the inevitability. Once projection and supply are broken, collapse begins, not by choice, not by punishment, but by law, psychological law. Next, I will show you the pivot point, the exact moment when the empath, often without fanfare, shifts from pleasing to perceiving. That is when the countdown begins. At first, you confuse compassion with compliance. You think patience is love, and silence is strength. For years, sometimes decades, you operate as the emotional regulator of another person's inner storm. Jung called such individuals the shock absorbers of the collective psyche, those who carry what others refuse to face. But every empath has a breaking point, and here lies the paradox. The pivot doesn't come with rage or revenge. It comes with clarity. Jung observed that the most terrifying shift in human psychology is not when someone explodes, but when they stop reacting at all. Because you once argued, explained, begged to be understood. You thought if you spoke with enough sincerity, the distortion would correct itself. But slowly you learned. Explanations do not dissolve projections. In fact, they strengthen them. Each attempt at defense became more evidence against you. Then something changes. You stop explaining. You stop overgiving. You stop bending yourself into the shape of someone else's emptiness. You move from pleasing to perceiving. And here, your vision sharpens. You begin to notice what Jung called the repair attempt test. When conflict arises, does the other move toward healing, or do they double down on distortion? The narcissist, unable to integrate their shadow, cannot repair. They escalate. Your calm unnerves them. Because your calm is no longer supply, it is refusal, and that refusal signals the end. This wasn't detachment, this was individuation. At this pivot point, the empath becomes what Jung described as the integrated observer, no longer the vessel of another's unconscious, but the mirror that reveals it. You see not just their words, but their patterns, not just their persona, but their shadow. And the one thing a narcissist cannot endure is being seen without mask. Therefore, the countdown begins. The 6 phases of collapse unfold the moment you stop playing the part they wrote for you. You exit the script, and the theater itself begins to burn. Next, we will step into phase 1, denial. The paper moon they build to convince themselves you will return, even as the stage beneath them crumbles. The first phase is almost theatrical. When you withdraw, the narcissist does not collapse immediately. They step onto a paper stage, beneath a paper moon, and perform a story for themselves. Nothing has changed. Jung noted that the psyche protects itself from annihilation through fictional narratives. When reality is unbearable, the unconscious constructs compensatory illusions. For the narcissist, denial is that illusion. They laugh too loudly. They flood social media with curated joy. They swipe through dating apps with exaggerated confidence. They tell anyone who will listen, they'll be back. They always come back. This wasn't confidence, this was collapse wearing a mask. Because denial is not an absence of awareness. It is awareness wrapped in panic. The narcissist senses the withdrawal of supply but cannot admit dependency. To admit it would be to face their own shadow, and that confrontation is unbearable. So they choose the script instead. Jung warned, when a persona becomes overinflated, any threat to it triggers psychic rigidity. Rather than adapt, the narcissist doubles down. They tell themselves you were dramatic, unstable, selfish. They construct a version of you that justifies their indifference. But beneath this performance, there is tremor. Their routines no longer regulate them. The silence in the room feels heavier than they can carry. They begin to overact because the absence is too loud. And here is your danger. If you watch closely, you may be tempted back. Their feigned indifference can awaken your old reflex to prove your worth, to remind them of your value. Resist it. For Jung taught that denial, when met with supply, reconstitutes itself into permanence. Your return would not heal. It would cement the cycle. Therefore, in this phase, your greatest act is to remain still. Their paper moon will collapse on its own. Next comes the inevitable second act, recruitment. When self-deception fails, they will attempt to gather an audience to believe the story on their behalf. When denial begins to crack, the narcissist cannot stand alone. They summon a chorus. Jung described this pattern as collective possession, when one person's unconscious projections infect the perceptions of others. The narcissist recruits, subtly or aggressively, to reinforce the story that keeps their fragile persona intact. It begins innocently, a concerned message to a mutual friend. I'm worried about them. They've been unstable. A carefully curated anecdote told at work. They were always difficult, but I tried so hard. Posts that drip with implication rather than fact, designed to seed suspicion. And here's the dark genius of recruitment. It does not demand open aggression. It weaponizes concern. The narcissist rarely says, they are evil. Instead, they sigh and say, I don't know what happened to them. I hope they find peace. This wasn't compassion. This was projection, disguised as care. Why do they do it? Because Jung noted that shadow projection becomes unbearable in isolation. The narcissist cannot carry the fiction alone. It must be distributed, validated, echoed. Each new recruit becomes both shield and amplifier. And what of you, the empath who has stepped away? Suddenly, you feel the shift in the room. Friends who once greeted you warmly now hesitate. Colleagues whisper. Family members ask loaded questions. You are no longer relating to them directly. You are relating through the narcissist's distortion field. The temptation here is to defend yourself, to explain, to clear your name. But Jung warned, arguments only strengthen possession. The more you resist the projection, the more evidence you provide for it. You appear defensive, and your defense becomes their proof. Therefore, your task in this phase is restraint. Adopt what I call the one-sentence policy, brief, factual, without explanation. Anything more pulls you into the theater of their making, because soon the chorus will not be enough. And when it fails to silence the vacancy, rage will enter the stage. When denial fails, when the chorus cannot hold the fiction, rage erupts. But this is not ordinary anger. Jung warned that rage rooted in projection always arrives clothed in righteousness. It is not, I am angry. It is, I am justified. Here the narcissist launches volleys of accusations with religious certainty. You betrayed me. You ruined everything. You are sick, unstable, dangerous. The intensity shocks you, because the content has little connection to reality, yet the conviction is absolute. Jung observed that during projection, the psyche literally rewrites perception. The narcissist does not believe they are lying. They believe they are revealing truth. This is why their fury feels sanctified. They rage not as aggressors, but as moral judges. Every word is delivered with the weight of divine authority, as though the universe itself has deputized them to prosecute you. And here lies the danger. If you engage, you will drown. The more you explain, the more evidence they collect. If you raise your voice, it confirms your instability. If you remain calm, it confirms your coldness. Rage, in this form, is a closed system. Jung's counsel was precise. Never argue with possession, because rage at this stage is not the individual speaking, it is the archetype. You are no longer confronting a person, but the shadow itself, inflated and unleashed. So what do? You enact what I call the two-gate rule. If their words are neither safe nor kind, they do not pass through your gates. No reply, no defense, no performance, only silence, or in extreme cases, legal and professional documentation. Because here is the inevitability, rage burns itself out. It cannot sustain. And when the fire falters, another mask will appear, the mask of reform, the bargain that promises change. After the flames of rage die down, the narcissist does not surrender. They pivot. They begin to bargain. But notice, this is not bargaining with humility. It is bargaining with mirrors. Jung observed that the psyche, when cornered, will adopt the very language of its victim in order to regain control. And so the narcissist studies you. They echo your words about growth, about therapy, about change. They say things like, I know I've been projecting. I'm ready to do the work now. This wasn't transformation. This was imitation. What makes this phase so treacherous is that it feels for a moment like breakthrough. The narcissist suddenly speaks your dialect of healing. They quote the books you've read. They nod at the concepts of shadow, trauma, boundaries. They weave a speech so compelling that you almost forget every cycle that came before. But Jung gave us the diagnostic key. Authentic transformation shows itself in structure, not speech. Structure means accountability, consistency, restitution. Speech is performance, designed to reopen the channel of supply. Because if they can convince you to believe, the entire cycle resets. Why do they do this? Because bargaining is the psyche's last attempt to keep its projection alive without collapse. To admit true responsibility would be to confront the shadow directly. And as Jung warned, the unintegrated ego would rather simulate growth than endure the death of its illusions. Your task here is ruthless discernment. Do not measure their words, measure their patterns. Is there ownership without excuses? Is there restitution without delay? Is there consistency without collapse? If not, You are not witnessing healing. You are witnessing a mirrored promise. And when the mirror fails, when you no longer believe the performance, they must move to the next survival tactic, image rehabilitation. A new stage, a new spotlight, a new audience. When you refuse the bargain, the narcissist shifts again. They abandon persuasion and turn to reinvention. Jung warned that the ego, desperate to survive, will shed skins like a serpent, constructing a fresh persona whenever the old one collapses. This is image rehab, a frantic attempt to rebuild their sense of worth through new stages, new audiences, new props. Suddenly, they are the perfect partner to someone else. The flawless colleague, generous friend, charitable soul. They are photographed smiling, celebrated for achievements, praised for their resilience. But look closer. It is the same script, rehearsed on a different stage. The new partner is paraded like proof of their capacity to love. The new community applauds their apparent generosity, and woven through it all are subtle, pointed contrasts. I've finally found someone who understands me. I've learned so much since leaving toxic people behind. This wasn't growth, this was performance. Why is this stage so seductive? Because the human psyche longs for closure. When you see them radiant and applauded, you begin to question your own reality. Maybe it was me. Maybe I was the unstable one. Look at how well they're doing without me. Jung called this the inflation of the persona, a brittle, overpolished mask that conceals the chaos beneath. Remember, the brighter the mask, the darker the shadow it hides. And here is the truth you must hold. Their highlight reel is a press release, not a diary. What you are seeing is not healing, but curation, a campaign to reassure themselves and the world that they are intact. But the psyche cannot live forever on borrowed applause. When the new stage begins to falter, and it always does, the final phase arrives. And it is not theatrical at all. It is quiet, heavy, unsettling. It is the silent vacancy. At last, the noise dies. The denial, the recruitment, the rage, the bargaining, the image rehab, all of it burns out. What remains is silence. But this silence is not peace. It is vacancy. Jung warned that when the ego loses every external anchor, it is forced to face the abyss within. He called this encounter the nigredo, the blackening, where all illusions fall away, and the unintegrated psyche stares into its own emptiness. For the narcissist, this is unbearable. Their entire life has been a flight from this void. Every mask, every projection, every performance was designed to outrun it. Now, with supply gone and applause faded, the silence returns with full weight. This is when you may receive strange messages, late-night texts, nostalgic fragments, accidental encounters that feel too coincidental to be random. They are not invitations to reconnect. They are proof of the vacancy echoing back at them. And here lies the paradox. In this phase, you may glimpse something that feels authentic, a softness, even sorrow, that never appeared before. Do not mistake it for transformation. Jung insisted, confrontation with the shadow is only the beginning of growth, never the guarantee of it. Most turn away, terrified. Few remain long enough to integrate. Your role now is compassion at distance. To feel empathy without re-entering the dynamic. To understand the vacancy without stepping back into it. Because the vacancy is not yours to fill, it never was. This wasn't reconciliation, this was residue. And yet, the silent vacancy carries a gift for you. It is the final confirmation that your withdrawal was not cruelty, but necessity. That your calm refusal created the conditions where illusion collapsed, not just for them, but for you. Next, we turn to your arc, the empath's counter journey. For while they collapse into vacancy, you step into individuation. While the narcissist spirals into vacancy, your path unfolds in the opposite direction. Their collapse is a descent into the void. Your departure, if made consciously, becomes the beginning of individuation, the process Jung called the privilege of a lifetime, becoming who you truly are. At first, the silence feels unbearable. You are detoxing from patterns that once defined your very sense of self. For years, you mistook absorption for love, compliance for compassion, sacrifice for strength. Now, stripped of the familiar drama, you may feel empty. Jung reassured his patients, this emptiness is not a failure, but a threshold. Because individuation always begins with de-enmeshment. Your nervous system learns that another person's chaos is not your responsibility. You start to notice when your body tenses, when your voice apologizes without cause, when your heart overextends. Each moment of awareness is a reclamation. Then comes re-symbolization. Jung taught that without symbols, the psyche starves. You begin to create rituals, hobbies, and values that are not performances, but expressions. What once drained you now becomes a source of meaning, art, nature, learning, solitude. Finally, you enter re-relating. This is not about rushing into new love or friendships. It is about discerning. Jung called it psychological discrimination, the ability to sense which bonds nourish and which bonds corrode. You learn to choose presence over performance, authenticity over approval. Because here is the law. As they collapse without supply, you rise by reclaiming yours. The same silence that destroys them becomes, for you, a sanctuary. This wasn't abandonment, this was rebirth. And yet, individuation does not complete itself automatically. You must learn skills, practices, and defenses to protect the ground you have won. That is why I will now give you a field kit, a set of scripts, boundaries, and crisis moves forged from Jung's principles, designed to keep you free. Jung warned that freedom without structure is fragile. The moment you reclaim yourself, the unconscious will attempt to pull you back into old patterns. Therefore, you need a field kit, practical tools that anchor your individuation and prevent relapse. First, scripts. You owe no elaborate explanations. The narcissist thrives on debate because debate reopens the channel of supply. Instead, use concise, closed statements. When they seek closure, I wish you well, but I won't revisit the past. When they hover with mixed signals, I'm not available for contact. If it's logistical, use email. Each script is a gate, short, final, impermeable. Second, boundaries. Jung spoke of psychological economy, the conscious management of your psychic energy. You must treat your attention as currency. Audit your digital spaces, block or mute as needed. Set policies for mutual contacts, no triangulation, no gossip. Guard your mornings and nights. These are the hours when your psyche is most vulnerable to intrusion. Third, crisis moves. There may be escalation, slander, threats, legal maneuvers. Jung insisted, never meet unconsciousness with unconsciousness. Instead, prepare. Document interactions meticulously, dates, times, verbatim. Consult counsel or HR when needed. Truth without structure is easily distorted. Build a safety plan, not paranoia, but preparedness. Freedom is not secured by hope, but by design. Because here is the reality. Individuation does not mean you will never be tested again. It means you are no longer defenseless. These tools transform reactivity into strategy, chaos into clarity. But even with tools, there are traps, common pitfalls that lure you back into old roles. And if you do not recognize them, they will cost you everything you have gained. Jung warned that the greatest dangers after liberation do not come from outside, they come from within. The psyche longs for the familiar, even if the familiar destroyed you. These are the pitfalls, and if you can name them, you can avoid them. Pitfall 1. Evidence debates. You feel the urge to prove your truth with facts, screenshots, timelines. But Jung cautioned, the unconscious does not yield to logic. A persona built on projection cannot be dismantled by evidence. Each time you try, you feed the illusion. Remember, your silence speaks louder than your defense. Pitfall 2. Therapy proxying. You may slip into the role of healer, thinking, if I guide them, they can change. But in doing so, you recreate the very dynamic you escaped. Jung observed that when the empath becomes the therapist for the narcissist, the cycle deepens, not dissolves. Healing offered without request is not healing. It is entrapment. Pitfall 3. Trauma chemistry confusion, the most dangerous of all. That familiar intensity, the adrenaline, the cortisol, the nervous electricity, feels like love. You tell yourself, no one else makes me feel this alive. But Jung insisted, what you are mistaking for passion is your nervous system reenacting the original wound. Chemistry is not compatibility. Fire is not warmth. These three pitfalls disguise themselves as virtue, honesty, compassion, loyalty. But in truth, they are unconscious agreements to re-enter the old prison. Your task is vigilance, to recognize that freedom requires discernment, not just escape. And once you learn to sidestep these traps, you are ready to ask the deeper question. What does real accountability look like? If words are cheap, what is the true currency of change? You have seen the masks, the denial, the rage, the bargain, the rehab. Each phase carries words, grand speeches, mirrored promises, declarations of change. But Jung warned, words without integration are nothing but persona, a mask painted with sincerity. So how do you know if accountability is real? Jung gave us 3 measures. First, ownership without evasion. True accountability begins with specific acknowledgement, naming the wound, not generalizing it. I lied when I said X. I manipulated you by doing Y. If you hear, I'm sorry you felt hurt, you are not hearing ownership. You are hearing evasion. Second, restitution without performance. Words mean little if not paired with repair. This is not grand gestures, but practical amends, replacing what was stolen, correcting the record, restoring what was broken, and, crucially, it is done quietly, without an audience. Jung taught that real shadow work is not spectacle. It is private, humbling, unspectacular labor. Third, consistency without collapse. Real change is measured over time. A day of clarity means nothing if followed by a week of old patterns. Jung insisted that individuation is slow fire. If they show progress for a season and then revert, the mask was only temporarily reinforced. Authenticity does not flash, it endures. Because here is the truth. Most will not reach this level. For many, persona is easier than humility, and projection feels safer than shadow work. Jung accepted this with clinical sobriety. Transformation is rare. Your task is not to wait for someone else to integrate. Your task is to measure patterns, not promises, and to withdraw when accountability is absent. Because once you know the texture of the real, the counterfeit loses all power. And when you see this clearly, the question arises, why does this dynamic repeat not only in your life, but in culture at large? What does this collapse and individuation mirror in our collective psyche? What you have lived in the micro, society enacts in the macro. Jung warned that the same dynamics shaping relationships between individuals also govern nations, ideologies, even entire epochs. The empath-narcissist loop is not just personal tragedy, it is cultural architecture. Look around. Entire systems thrive on projection. Politicians cast their shadow onto enemies. Corporations curate personas polished to a blinding shine while hiding their wounds in secrecy. Algorithms feed outrage because outrage is supply. It regulates the collective psyche by keeping us reactive, divided, dependent. The empath in this cultural equation is you, the citizen who absorbs the weight of dysfunction, the worker who sacrifices endlessly, the consumer who is told that silence equals safety. You are asked to bear the shadow of the collective, to carry the anxieties and unintegrated wounds of institutions that refuse to do their own work. This wasn't leadership, this was vampirism on a mass scale. And just as in the personal dynamic, collapse comes when the empath withdraws. When you stop feeding systems with blind attention, when you refuse the manipulative bargain, when you withdraw your energy from toxic cycles, the facade cracks. Jung called this the tension of opposites. When enough individuals individuate, the collective must evolve or collapse. Therefore, your individuation is not selfish, it is cultural medicine. Each time you reclaim your energy from a manipulative system, you create a fracture in the mask of the collective persona. And through those fractures, truth enters. So ask yourself, where are you still the empath of society? Where are you absorbing shadows that are not yours to carry? Because when you stop, the system must change, or die. And to anchor this truth, let me tell you a story, a parable Jung himself might have shared, of what happens when one empath finally refuses the performance. Let me give you a living image, a parable drawn from Jung's clinical cases and echoed in countless lives since. There was a woman, we'll call her Anna, who spent years entangled with a man skilled in every mask. When she confronted betrayal, he returned not with denial or rage, but with eloquence. He wrote her a letter, pages long, filled with insights about shadow work, about childhood wounds, about his newfound commitment to change. But as Jung observed, the unconscious always leaks truth between the lines. Anna noticed something startling. Not once in all those pages did he use the word sorry. Not once did he name the harm directly. He spoke in abstractions, in philosophy, in mirrors, but never in ownership. And in that omission, Anna saw everything. This was not remorse. This was performance. The apology that never used the word sorry was not an oversight. It was the essence of the bargain. An attempt to reopen supply without ever confronting shadow. For years, Anna would have clung to that letter, studied it for hidden promises, mistaken eloquence for change. But now, having shifted from pleasing to perceiving, she recognized the pattern. She put the letter away, unopened again, and did not respond. Jung said, "The patient is not cured when he stops lying to others. He is cured when he stops lying to himself." Anna understood that this letter was not a confession, but a continuation of the lie. Her silence was the treatment. And what happened next? The cycle did not restart. It ended. Because when an empath refuses the apology without ownership, the entire performance collapses. This wasn't cruelty, this was clarity. And clarity leads us back to where we began, to the paradox of silence. But now, the silence means something different. It is no longer vacancy, it is integration. We began with silence, the silent vacancy, that hollow absence that devours the narcissist from within. But now you see the paradox. The same silence that destroys them becomes the ground of your rebirth. For them, silence is terror. It is the collapse of persona, the exposure of shadow, the confrontation with emptiness they cannot endure. For you, silence is sanctuary. It is the space where your soul gathers its fragments and begins to speak in its own voice. This wasn't abandonment. This was individuation. Jung reminded us, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. For the narcissist, this terror remains unbearable. They flee, project, rage, rehearse. But you who have walked through the cycle and stepped out, you are learning to bear it. You are learning that emptiness is not the end, but the threshold, the black soil from which new life emerges. Because you withdrew, because you refused the bargain, because you let the mask collapse without rescuing it, you did not just survive the cycle, you transformed it. Their collapse became your coherence. Their vacancy became your vision. And so we return to the hook. The danger was never that you loved too much. The danger was believing that your love required you to vanish. Now you know the truth. Your silence does not mean absence. It means presence. Yours, finally, fully, and without disguise. But integration is not theory, it is practice. And to make this transformation real, you need structure. That is why I will now give you a 30-day recalibration plan, a step-by-step process to anchor this individuation in your daily life. Jung taught that insight without practice dissolves back into illusion. To make individuation real, you must embody it. Here is a 30-day recalibration plan, a map through 4 weeks of restructuring your inner and outer life. Week 1. Conscious detox. Strip away what agitates your nervous system. Limit contact, mute the digital echoes, refuse to revisit the archive of texts and letters. Replace stimulation with stillness. Walk in the morning sun. Sleep deeply. Your body must learn that safety exists without performance. Week 2. Stability rituals. Jung insisted on symbolic anchors, practices that remind the psyche of its own wholeness. Begin a daily breathing ritual. Try the fourfold breath. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4. End each cycle with a written sentence. I am not responsible for what is not mine. Week 3. Re-symbolize. This is the stage of discovery. Ask Jung's question in active imagination. What wants to be born through me? Pay attention to the images, desires, and fascinations that arise. Follow them in small ways. Paint, write, study, plant. Do not demand meaning. Let meaning emerge. Week 4. Re-relate. Test your new boundaries in low-stakes relationships. Practice saying no without justification. Practice saying yes when something genuinely excites you. Jung called this psychological discrimination, the art of discerning real connection from projection. Because here's the paradox. Your old motivation was fueled by fear of loss. Your new motivation will be fueled by alignment with self. That transition takes practice, and 30 days is the soil in which it begins to root. This isn't a cure, it's a recalibration, but it is enough to shift the center of gravity from vacancy to vitality. And now, let me bring it all together. One final cadence, a closing affirmation, and a call to step into what is next. The danger was never that you saw too clearly. The danger was believing that your vision made you broken. The collapse of the narcissist is not your story, it is theirs. Your story is the refusal to collapse with them. Your story is the silence that became sanctuary, the emptiness that became rebirth. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." You have done exactly that. You made the darkness conscious, both theirs and your own. And in that act, you became immune to the illusions that once bound you. Remember the cadence. The danger isn't that you love too much. It's failing to build a conscious relationship with that love. Use it now as cultural medicine, as constructive leverage, as a gift to the collective. Here is my call to you. Do not let this remain theory. Identify which phase you have witnessed most clearly. Write it down. Then name one boundary sentence you will practice this week. Share it with others, because when you speak it aloud, you anchor it in reality. And when you are ready, take the next step. Explore the deeper work of shadow integration, the process Jung saw as the true task of a lifetime. Because individuation is not an event, it is a way of being. You are not the vacancy. You are the presence that remains when vacancy collapses.